wanted to just remind you to all just make sure, particularly if you are just joining us, to make sure that you're muted throughout, so that we can all make sure that we can hear Victoria lovely and clearly. We are recording the event this evening, so if you don't want to be seen, please do turn off your video. I think everybody is so familiar with Zoom these days, but for anybody who is newer, a couple of things. If you make sure in the top corner that you put it on speaker view, then you'll be able to see Victoria nice and clearly as well when she's speaking. At the bottom, you can turn on the chat, which should come up to the side of the screen. So at any point, if you think of a question that you would like to ask Victoria, please can you type it into the chat. And then what I will do is, after Victoria has spoken about the novel for a while, I will invite people in turn to unmute yourself and ask your questions of Victoria. So yeah, please do put anything down in the chat so that I can see that you've got something that you would like to ask. And then I think that's just about everything. So I can move on now to welcoming our very special guest, Victoria Hislop. Thank you so much for joining us, Victoria.
It's a real pleasure. And a few months ago, I don't think we'd have imagined we could still have any kind of event or, reader, author talk. So it's fantastic. And we're all pretty grateful to technology and to you particularly for making this happen. So thank you.
Oh, honestly, thank you. Like, honestly, it's an absolute pleasure. So I know that many of the people who have come along this evening will know and be so familiar with all of your books. They've been, I don't know, so many like incredible bestsellers that you've written over the years. But tonight you're going to be introducing a sequel to what's possibly your most love novel, The Island. So I wonder, do you want to introduce One August Night?
Yes, well, the very first novel I wrote was this one, The Island, which I think is probably the one that most people have read. And the book sort of finishes almost in the present day, because it's a young woman exploring her grandparents and her grandmother's past. And I never imagined I would write a sequel. I felt it was finished, put away, the characters, had wandered off in their different directions. And then, like all of us in March, I found myself inside my own home, which is a very unusual situation for me in writing terms, because I'm usually traveling a lot. And I came up with the idea of going back to revisit some of those characters, and the resulting story is One August Night, which picks up not exactly from the ending of The Island, but it dips back about 40 pages before The Island ends, and just develops and expands on that period when people have, in fact, their lives have been shattered. That's what the title refers to, One August Night. For people who've got very good memories, might remember that the same night when all the patients from Spinalonga have been cured and they all leave the island with great excitement and anticipation for their new and happier lives, they come back to Plaka, and there's a big, what in Greece is called a glendi, a big party with dancing and singing and feasting. And as the fireworks are going up into the sky and making those sort of characteristic noises that fireworks and rockets make, there are suddenly these other bangs, and a moment after they've happened, somebody in the crowd realizes that those are actually gunshots. And what has happened is that the sister of Maria, who's just come back from Spinalonga with all this excitement, her sister has been shot by her jealous husband. So that's not a spoiler, because I think most people remember that moment from The Island. But it was a sort of starting point for the story, a moment which in a way changes everybody's lives. They all thought they were going to be changed for the better, but then something very unexpected happens. So, as I say, because I wasn't traveling to Greece during the lockdown period, I knew that I needed to draw completely on my imagination, that I couldn't go around poking about in archives or visiting new places in Greece. I had to delve back inside myself. And Crete still seemed to me full of untold stories. So One August Night is the result.
Oh, thank you, Victoria. I think as well as obviously going back to Crete, I mean, there are certain characters that you have chosen to go further on their journeys with than others, and I was, well, one of them, you mentioned that, Anna was killed by her jealous husband for an affair that she'd been having with his cousin Manoli, and Manoli's such a rogue in the island, and we do learn a lot more of his story in One August Night, and I wonder if, despite his roguishness, if you always had a slight soft spot for him, why you chose to sort of, pursue
It's a
him.
good question, but I think in spite of ourselves, you know, women have a soft spot for roguish men. There's no doubt. I mean, there are many stereotypes in literature, many examples, Troy in Far from the Madding Crowd, who's a absolutely beastly character, but we can see why Bathsheba falls for him. There's Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights. He's a very destructive, dangerous person, but of course Cathy falls in love with him. She marries someone else, but the man that she has a real passion for, is Heathcliff. There are so many. But Manoli, I felt, without sort of becoming too psychoanalytical about one's own characters, I felt that Manoli did have some kind of redemption to take place in his future. He's the character whose mother died in childbirth, and then his father not long afterwards. So he's been brought up by two very kind people, his uncle and aunt, who've done their absolute best with him. But ultimately, something has been lacking in his life. And that's why I think he travelled for all those years, womanizing and drinking and, generally getting up to no good all around the capitals of Europe. So I felt that there was something more that he still had to live. And so he is very much a focus of this story. And indeed, the three real main characters, I think perhaps for the first time in a book that I've written, are all male. Because the other character, Andreas, Manoli's cousin and now a murderer, he's taken an action very spontaneously. I'm not excusing him for, murdering Anna in any way whatsoever, but he's killed his wife in this uncontrollable fury. And again, I want to see in my imagination what effect that has. And then the third man, all these three men that I write about are people who have been in love with Anna. And there's actually a nice quote that my publisher picked out to go on the back about Anna. And it says, this is a quote from the island, it says, "Anna's beauty was a gift as well as a curse. And a woman like that will always drive men to extreme behaviour." So, I think that is to some extent true. And then the third man who she drives to extreme behaviour is her sort of childhood sweetheart, Adonis. So there are these three men, whose lives are, let's say, they're not destroyed by Anna, but the path of their lives take a very different course because of her.
I think Anna is somebody else that it would be lovely to speak about a bit this evening, um, because you say, you know, you wrote this in lockdown, when I suppose so many of us were yearning for closer contact with our family and our friends. And Anna is so interesting because she almost put herself in lockdown, away from her family and friends, in sort of marrying the sort of local gentry. She left behind her family in the village, and her actions, I wonder, you know, the way she lived and the effect she had on people, because of her isolation from her family and friends. And I don't know if you'd like to speak a little bit about her.
Yes, yeah, Anna does isolate herself in a very, I think, very un-Greek way, because in Greece, the family and your loyalty to your parents and your siblings is immensely strong in general. You know, the family is very much, you know, the core unit of society. But she has sort of removed herself completely and kind of rejects her family. But one of the reasons that that rejection is all the stronger is because she's very ashamed that her mother had died of leprosy, and then of course her sister gets leprosy. So for her, you know, that's something that she wants to hide, and if she can remove herself as far away as possible, you know, from her humble origins, then she will do so. And you know, whether or not that contributes to this sort of almost corrupt way she starts to live, you know, but she doesn't really care about her father anymore, and certainly doesn't want to know anything about her sister, who in those sort of latter years of her life is a leprosy patient. I don't know if she's a completely, I mean, there are moments when as I was writing more about her character in this book, there were moments when I did feel sorry for her. It's surprising how you can start to take pity on your own villains. But again, this is another characteristic, I think, of writing of, you know, your rogues and your villains. They're actually more interesting to write about, you know. And I remember quite often when I was asked questions about the island, and it's usually came from younger readers who see things, you know, teenage readers who I have a lot of in Greece. They like to see things in black and white. So they'd say, "Are you Anna or are you Maria?" Which I always thought really a good challenging question. And of course, you know, I'm neither. But I certainly never thought Maria was the most interesting character. She's very good. She finds it very unchallenging to be good, whereas Anna is sort of born with this vanity. And I think some of it does come from her beauty. You know, I think often excessively beautiful women, probably men too, but you know, I remember one sees this all through life and in different age groups. Very, very beautiful women are often not always the nicest people, because, you know, the doors seem to open for them, paths are just kind of cleared for them, and they get this almost passport that plainer women, more normal looking women have. And I sometimes have, you know, I've not had that many excessively beautiful friends, because they normally sort of stick together, these women. But I think sometimes I've looked upon their beauty as something detrimental to their lives. You know, maybe when I was a teenager or in my 20s, I thought how marvelous to have, you know, waist length, raven black hair and incredible skin, none of which I had. But as I've got older, I've wondered whether actually I really would have wanted to have those things. I think, you know, Anna is a victim of her own beauty. You know, I it's not much written about, but I really don't regard beautiful women as the lucky ones, and Anna certainly isn't.
No, poor Anna, she certainly isn't. Um, so maybe it's interesting because it's like when reading both books, I could feel almost the coming of age, like The Island feels very much a coming of age, perhaps for Sophia as a character in all that she learns about her history. But it's interesting looking at the sort of maturity and the reflection over both books, because I think there's something that I wanted to touch on. You write, I mean, you write really beautiful party scenes, and dancing, I think, is something that has been so, dancing and parties is something that has been missing so much from our lives over the past few months, that it's lovely to read and sort of, you know, feel caught up in those moments. And I don't think it's too much of a spoiler, but there's a dance that you described Manoli doing, where it's like in his youth he has all the physical ability to do it magnificently, but when he does it all, when he's older, he has more of the understanding behind it. And I wondered if you'd like to talk a little bit about that, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I could actually just read that little
Yeah, that would
passage
be perfect.
rather than describe it, because it's hard to do one without actually going into the passage. It's this very extraordinary dance that I'm sure lots of the audience will have perhaps seen happening in Greece. It's called the Zebekiko, and it's traditionally only danced by men. And you know, really, if a woman stands up and takes the floor and dances this dance, then, you know, she might be in big trouble. And the Zebekiko, in a way, conveys grief and sadness, and it'll usually happen very spontaneously at any kind of Greek event where there are musicians, and there are certain rhythms and songs which will immediately be picked up on by the audience. So there's a moment where Manolis dances this dance, and for him, I suppose it's the physical equivalent of weeping. It's like crying, but he's doing it with his whole body. With several carafes of ouzo inside him and grief weighing on him like a boulder, Manoli stretched his arms out like an eagle and began to turn. The movements were personal, but the tradition of the Zebekiko was known to everyone. It was a dance that should only be performed by a man, and only by a man with grief to express. As the musicians played and the insistent beat thumped and repeated and thumped again, Manolis revolved slowly in a trance-like state, his eyes glazed, unfocused. Someone threw a plate at his feet, and one of the girls tossed a flower that she had been wearing in her hair. He was aware of neither. Yanis, Dimitris, and several others knelt down as if in worship and clapped their hands in time with the distinctive 9/8 rhythm. The dance gave him the opportunity to reveal the darkest corners of his soul. The movements were restrained, tense, controlled, and yet they opened a window into his heart for anyone who looked and cared to understand. All eyes were on him, willing him on. Still turning with arms outstretched, he folded forwards and then bent back in a limbo. The sight of this tall and strikingly handsome man performing something almost acrobatic held the attention of everyone in the room. With each turn, he expressed the agony he felt, for the woman he loved, for the tragedy of her death, for his wretched cousin languishing in a prison cell, for his uncle and aunt lamenting the fate of their only son, for Sophia, who had lost both mother and father, for Yorgos, who mourned his daughter, and for Maria, who would be weeping over her sister. Everyone watched, mesmerized. So that's the dance, and it is a huge treat if you see someone performing it, and I have done sort of lots of times at weddings and baptisms, and it completely transfixes me when I see someone doing that dance, and you freeze and just watch, and it's very, very wonderful.
Thank you, Victoria. Just hearing you speak about that, I mean, it's 15 years since you wrote The Island, and I wonder, you, I think you write in the back of One August Night about how it was on a holiday with your family that you first came across Spina Longa, and just, I suppose, since then you've got to know Greece so incredibly well. I wonder, going back in your imagination, was there anything that you wished you could have changed ever so slightly, with details that you know now, perhaps? Or I don't know, I wonder.
Yeah, I mean, there's an awful lot in the island that was written in some ways with a certain naivety, but actually sometimes that can be a good thing. So I would never change it. I think that would be sort of the wrong thing to do. But there are odd things, like the way I spelt Yorgos, the father of Anna and Maria, who's married to Eleni in this book. And I don't know quite what I was thinking of by my spelling, so I've actually changed it to the correct spelling in there. So it's little details like that that I've allowed myself to amend. The odd thing about the 15 years ago period of writing this was that at that time I certainly didn't speak any Greek, and I wasn't able really to communicate with anybody in Plaka or the villages, which sounds odd now, but I actually think it was an advantage, because now if I was sitting in Plaka or Ilunda or Ios Nikolaos, people would chat to me and they would tell me their real stories. And I've done that since, but in order to write completely with your imagination, it can be very intrusive, sounds a bit rude, but it can slightly invade your imaginative space. So it's odd that I wouldn't actually change anything in here, but I know if I was writing it now in 2020, I would feel obliged to include a lot more of the reality of Spinalonga, and some of perhaps the much darker things. I mean, I sort of write it quite sparingly. I don't talk in this book about a lot of the cruelty that happened on Spinalonga, because I didn't know about it, and I think it would have changed the kind of atmosphere of the book considerably. So it's odd to be glad retrospectively to have been slightly ignorant, and to all the times when I used to visit, I would just sit very privately and make my notes and scribble things that I wanted to write, without a lovely, friendly Cretan villager coming and sitting next to me and saying, "Oh, so what are you doing?" You know what I mean? Because I wouldn't have understood the words, "What are you doing?"
Oh, and so, as you said, you were left with your imagination again and no Cretan villages.
Yes.
At the start of lockdown. So do you want to talk a little bit about yes, exactly how you came to write the sequel?
Yes.
At this
Well,
particular
at
time?
this very time, well, there seemed to be all these uncanny things that reminded me of the Spinalonga situation. Number one, we were all very much in isolation, and away from our families, not with the people we wanted to be. And so that sort of reminded me of lots of people who couldn't see their grandparents or their parents, and they were sort of waving at them through windows, and still are in many cases. So there was a sort of Spinalonga, that closeness but distance that we were experiencing, and of course having an incurable disease, which we still have now, but for a very long time the patients with leprosy were waiting for the cure, and they were rewarded with their patience. It finally came. So there was all that going on, and lots of people had said, "Gosh, doesn't this remind you of another disease?" And I kept thinking, yes, it does a little bit. And then there was the situation of simply being inside the house. The other thing I was doing was reading, but it's also, for me, you know, a very enjoyable activity to write, and it seemed a kind of perfect moment. In a way, I think everybody had their ways of getting through lockdown, but for me it was the routine of getting up, making a pot of coffee at 8:30, sitting at my desk at 8:45 and being there for the next sort of 8 or 9 hours. And it was, you know, it was a very kind of mixed few months, as I think many people had. They did have one or two happy moments. You know, a lot of us found ourselves with older children in the house, something we'd never expected would happen again, you know, except at Christmas. And, you know, we all had our projects during that time, and, you know, we were all relatively productive. So, yes, for me, it was a very uplifting element of lockdown was to write this book and to kind of, as I say, to feel some catharsis for the characters. I think, you know, without making it too autobiographical, because books always, whether or not you think you're being autobiographical, there are always elements of yourself in anything that you write. At least they are for me. And, you know, there were some good moments and some sad moments in those months, and I'm sure they're somehow, you know, all locked up in there as well. Yeah. And I should add, because readers will probably notice it, if they're sort of careful readers, they'll notice that it's dedicated to my mother, and the island was dedicated to my mother. Her name is in all the copies of the island that exist, which was rather wonderful. And then I dedicated this to her because she died in March. So that was another factor. It was a sort of way of, I suppose, dealing with grief and, you know, giving her a present. So that's how I think of it. It's a gift for her. And I'm sorry she'll never read it, but maybe up there she'll get a glimpse of it. I don't know. So yeah, it was a big few months. You know, it started with Mum's death, and sort of ended with, you know, coming out of this period and tonight with the publication of a book. So yeah.
Well, there's a lot to celebrate in that, and that is incredibly beautiful. I had noticed that about your mother. It was one of the questions I was going to
Oh,
ask.
was it? Oh
Yeah,
gosh.
and
Yeah.
yeah, no, I thought that was rather beautiful, and also one of the themes that I picked up on reading One August Night, and I think there's quite a big, well, I wanted to say forgiveness. There's a lot of forgiveness in it between the
Mm.
characters, um, and a lot of kindness actually as well, in that some of the friendships that are made, there's a lot of good seen in people. That's what I would say, you know, even if, you know, outwardly, you know, people could be judged in different ways. I felt that there was a lot of a good good feeling,
Yeah.
good judgment. And
That's a really nice observation, because it's not something that I intended. You know, when I'm writing, I don't sort of think, oh, I'm writing along this theme, or I'm, you know, not injecting qualities into characters. But yes, I think on the whole, I think there is good in everybody. And generally, I think just from my own understanding of people, that maybe particularly during this last few months as well, you know, that we've all had to, the only way it's been survivable is to be more patient with each other, more forgiving of each other, you know, to be much slower to anger. You know, I know there are always exceptions to these things. You know, I personally, every time I was banned from mentioning the name Boris for that whole lockdown, because I would just go from 0 to 150 in my fury. So that, you know, anger certainly existed, but not spreading that anger. You know, we all had to be very, I think it was better if we were all kind to each other. So maybe that's somewhere in the pages of this book too. Yeah. I haven't invented any new villains in any case during this story.
No, I didn't notice any.
Hmm.
So yes, I wondered as well, something else happened that you also put in the book. And it says in 2020, and I don't know whether it was pre lockdown or during lockdown, I can't remember. It says you were given honorary Greek citizenship. And I wonder
Yes,
if you could
well,
talk a little bit about that.
yeah, good things happen as well as difficult things. And yes, that was the most wonderful moment of lockdown. It was almost a surprise because I think it was a Wednesday night, middle of July. I had a slightly strange phone call from a man in Athens, and it didn't even occur to me that it was any kind of fraud, which a lot of my friends have told me they would have been very suspicious. But it was a gentleman from the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which always sounds something very Orwellian. And he was asking, just simply, he didn't say why, he just said, I need to know your father's middle name, which maybe, you know, my friends say that could have been your password. I mean, it isn't, but so I said, well, you know, his middle name was his middle name. And then the conversation ended. And the following morning, I had another call from a Greek lady, and she said, very simply, she said, good morning, and this is in Greek, I have the Prime Minister on the line for you. So, you know, I'd guessed, I'd had an inkling the previous night that some weird thing was going on with my Greek identity, hence the need to know the father's middle name. And lo and behold, Mr. Mitsotakis was on the other end of the phone offering me honorary citizenship. And then the following day they publish in their sort of parliamentary gazette this announcement that, you know, I was being offered or given honorary citizenship for the promotion of Greece through my writing, and in particular of Spinalonga, which has become a very much visited destination. So yeah, it was very, very, very wonderful and very thrilling. And in September, I went there to actually take my oath, you know, to swear my allegiance, which they kind of already had anyway, but it had to be formal, and to have a meeting with the Prime Minister and then the President. So yes, it was a very, very wonderful thing. And to me, gosh, I suppose, you know, for anybody, something good coming out of the blue, you know, bad things come out of the blue, but also good things come out of the blue. So it was a sort of, you know, not going on too much about my mother, but the beginning of that period, you know, began pre-lockdown with the death of my mother. And then somehow the bookend, if I could think of it, is, you know, my citizenship. So, you know, good and bad. And I'm very proud.
It sounds incredibly special.
Yes, it was. It was a great day.
I'm going to ask uh, Jackie if she would like to unmute herself and ask a question, because it seems a good moment whilst we're sort of basking in Greek love, as it were, for you to unmute yourself and ask your question, Jackie.
Okay, I can't remember exactly what I wrote, but I wanted to ask Victoria, how was it that Greece got under her skin, and not Spain? Because I read The Island, I loved it, and then I read The Return, and I started reading it when I was in Granada.
Oh gosh.
And I absolutely adored that book, and I'd had no idea about the Spanish Civil War before I read the book. And I just wondered why it was that Greece got to you in a way that Spain didn't.
It's a really good question. Not easy to answer, although, you know, when I look around, I've got all these shelves full of books on Spain and, you know, great love of it. Perhaps I felt that many other people were writing about Spain and much better than I possibly could. I felt slightly not inadequate because I enjoyed writing the return. It was really important for me because I, you know, went through all the discovery about the Civil War and that aftermath of, you know, decades of Franco being, you know, the general being in charge of the country and the way that the people who'd fought against him continued to suffer. I think that the really odd thing is that there's a sort of strange connection between that book and the third one that I wrote, The Thread, which took us to Thessaloniki. And namely, that was the expulsion of the Jewish population from Granada in 1492. And then 1942, you know, they had gone to Thessaloniki, most of them back in 1492. And then in 1942, they were expelled again and sent to Auschwitz. And I think there was something about the thread, or writing the thread, that just pulled me in so deeply into Greek history and many kind of centuries and decades of it, that drowning sounds a really negative thing, but I felt really like I was right inside Greek history. Whereas with Spanish history, I felt I knew about that one period. And I didn't feel I had more to offer on it. But it's not because I don't love Spain, but, you know, then one thing led to another with, you know, the thread. And I think by that time we bought a house in Crete. So I was going there much more. And I feel much more immersed. I feel more connected when I'm in Greece. But the curious thing now is, you know, our daughter has a massively strong connection with, you know, emotional and linguistic connection with Spain and South America. So, you know, and there's no particular rhyme or reason unless we do a DNA test and actually find, you know, maybe we have some sort of ancient blood DNA connection. But I'm glad you enjoyed the return. I mean, it was a great experience, but I honestly don't think I would now write another book set in Spain. And again, I'm always reading really good books set in Spain by other people. You know, C.J. Sansom wrote The Winter in Madrid, and I read that and I thought, wow, he really knows his Spain. And, you know, Jason Webster, you know, there are big sections in the bookshop. But I'm glad you liked it anyway. I'm really gratified.
And it's interesting actually what you said about the thread being similar, in as much as it's to do with the Jews being expelled from Spain
Yes.
in 1492. Because actually I have a big soft spot for the thread as well, which I only read recently.
Because of course still in Thessaloniki, the very few number of Sephardic Jews that, you know, survived, some of them, you know, still have the knowledge of that language, the Ladino, which is essentially Spanish. You know, they have many songs that they still sing that are essentially. So I always think, you know, there is a connection between those books. You know, if it's a sad one, you know, it's a terrible connection, but it was one I wanted to write about. Yeah, anyway, thank you for your question.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I wanted to go back to the Greek culture and the parties actually, Victoria, and talk a little bit about food. I wondered because you described so many Greek dishes, like mouth-wateringly, and I wondered, are you able to to make them? Are you a good cook of Greek
Well,
food?
the secret ingredient, not very secret, but if you add enough really good olive oil to most things, things taste fantastic. And of course, it's a bit more difficult here because it's not that cheap. But in Crete, you know, people give me these. They're usually things that you carry if your car breaks down and you go from the, you know, the petrol station to fill up your car. You know, those old big tins that we used to keep gasoline in. But in Crete, you know, they fill them with this incredible olive oil. So I do cook a lot when I'm in Greece because the ingredients are all so lovely. And on the whole, if you buy your vegetables in a market, you know, they often don't even say they're organic. They just are organic because they don't use anything. They've come from their small holding. They bring them to the market. So, yeah, I mean, I cook a lot when I'm there because it's a question of throwing things in a pan, putting the olive oil, bunging them in the oven. You know, these are sort of vegetable dishes that I do a lot with, you know, aubergines and tomatoes and, you know, lovely onions. But I don't cook elaborate. You know, I've never in my life, and I can safely say I will never cook phyllo pastry, which is this sort of, you know, layers and layers and layers of absolutely infinitesimally thin pastry. I would never go that far. But I do make spinach pie, you know, spanakopita, but I buy my phyllo pastry. So, but all the food that I generally refer to, you know, in this new book and in previous ones, they're generally very simple dishes. You know, spanakorizo, which is one of my, I mean, I cannot stop eating. If somebody gives me, I get given food in Crete by friends who think that, you know, I need feeding. So they give me these sort of huge Tupperware tubs of this thing called spanakorizo, which is just spinach and rice. With, you know, the flavour is amazing because they add just the right amount of lemon. It's that simple. I think those are the only ingredients. And I cannot stop eating it. You know, I can eat, you know, probably a kilo of that in a sitting. But it's very simple dishes are my favourite.
Well, I just think it adds to the whole atmosphere of the reading because it's, I suppose it's in Fortini's restaurant as well as the party scenes. It's sort of like woven, I think.
Yes, there's always food. I think, you know, they perhaps in Crete more than, you know, I can't really generalize about every, you know, town and city in Greece, but in Crete, you know, there's always plenty of food. You know, they have right in the center of Crete this enormous plateau, which is, when you get up there, you know, the temperature is usually 10 degrees less, but they grow potatoes and wheat and none of the things that you wouldn't expect to see growing on a Greek island. There's always a sense of plenty, certainly where vegetables are concerned. So yes, I mean, there's not a house that you go in that doesn't smell of cooking in Greece, in Crete certainly. Yeah.
And I wondered as well, because you spent, am I right in thinking you spent quite a bit of time on the mainland as well for your last?
Yeah, yes. I have, you know, I've travelled a lot on the mainland for Carte Postale,
Yes.
which was the book with the photographs in it. You know, that was a very big journey that I did and took in north, south, east, and west. And I do these actually rather amazing. Well, you know, I'm sure they'll happen again. But when my books come out in Greek, I usually do a tour for at least 2 weeks, where every night I visit a different town and stay there. So I usually have, you know, the morning traveling, get there in the afternoon, look around, go for a walk, go to a museum, and then do the talk in the evening. And I was thinking about the one that I did, would be a year ago, for Those Who Are Loved in Greek. And we went right up to the north, which is almost the border with Albania. And there you see bears, you know, and it is unbelievably cold. And one of the main industries in Castoria, which was one of the cities I went to, is fur coats. You know, it's a completely opposite. So I started there, but actually perhaps I ended in place with the bears. The very southern bit was the south coast of Crete, which the next stop is Libya. You know, on a clear day, I swear, you know, it's across the Libyan Sea. So very different landscape. And then to the east to Alexandroupoli, which is almost the border with Turkey, you know, and then the west, which is, you know, the Ionian Islands, very green, very lush, you know, opposite Corfu. So, you know, Greece is hugely varied. And, you know, I've been very lucky to do these kind of astonishing, you know, up and down and side to side and always going to new places. And there's never really been anywhere that I don't either like or feel inspired by, you know. So it's a great country to travel in.
Sounds wonderful. I'm going to ask Becky Matthewson if you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question of Victoria.
It's Scott and Becky. We're here together.
Oh, hello.
It's really a question about a cultural question, really. My father and my grandmother, my grandfather, all dead now, but my father would tell me that my adopted grandmother married her crippled husband because she always probably subconsciously felt that she herself was disabled because of the fact that she was adopted. And it always seemed very complicated to me, a very complicated way to think. And we went to Athens for the first time last year with our children, and we were expecting to be amazed by the ancient ruins and so on, and we were really blown away by them. But we were more blown away by the Athenians and the way that they were, and the way that they behaved. And it seemed that their character was so different from the English character. But I was interested in the discussion of your character, who has this perceived reaction to her sister's inverted commas defect, and that sort of has an expression in her character. And I was just really reaching, I think, for some sort of connection between the English relationship with guilt and that funny Presbyterian, I think, sort of self-lashing, and Greek people who, and we don't know that many Greek people. I've got a very good friend, an Athenian, who I was at university with, but I was just reaching really for a connection between us and wanting to know whether you've recognised any similarities.
Gosh, I think that we're incredibly different. You know, it's interesting that you felt that, I think, as well, that I don't know what it is. It's like the black box in us is, you know, we're not all made of the same material. You know, I've now got this strange dual nationality, and that it, you know, I feel a bit, wow, I've got this, but I'm never going to be actually Greek. I think certainly in the last, well, I mean, I know much more about the last 100 years of Greek history, but they have been on a roller coaster. You know, they've suffered sort of occupation, which involved a huge famine, civil war, you know, dictatorships too. You know, they have earthquakes. You know, life is often threatens the individual, and they often feel, you know, like they're struggling. I think life, many Greeks, I don't know if it's true of the Athenians that you met, but there is a sense that life is a big struggle, and yet they're going to jolly well enjoy it. There's a great sort of joie de vivre that they want to grab hold of. You know, if you had a nice opportunity to go out, you know, and eat and drink with them, they do a lot of things to excess. There's nothing very half-hearted about them, and you obviously had a nice time with them, so you know, a bit of you, it's very attractive, you know, and it is very appealing. But a critic of the Greeks would say, well, that's why they're, you know, often having a financial crisis, you know, because during the time when they could borrow money, you know, and there were lots of, you know, cheap money available, they all, you know, the number of Porsches that you saw in Athens was absolutely ridiculous, you know, and now they're all having to pay back. I think I compare them, because I've travelled a bit in Norway as well, and I love the Norwegians too, but the Norwegians, you know, they came into all the oil discovery and decided that they weren't going to get all this oil and all become incredibly rich and drive Porsches. They're going to leave a lot of it there for future generations, and everything, they've got enough. They're very measured. I think if the Greeks made a big oil discovery, they get it all out and have a massive great party. The Norwegians, you know, I think we're maybe somewhere in the middle. But I think their character is something to do with the sort of uncertainty of life, which gives them this appetite for it at the same time. But I'm sure it's much more complex than I've made it sound. But so do you think you've got some Greek blood of any kind, or this was...
No, not at all. We've got a very good friend who's in Athens. But a university friend that we both knew from 28 years ago, and we've stayed in touch with. But he has exactly what you've described. That sense,
almost a recklessness in some ways. Yes, I mean that's common. He sounds quite typical.
But with an eye on 1,000 years' time. And the way that things will look at, and it's that tension that he deals with so comfortably, the immediate problems that Athens and Grecians are facing, but with a philosophical side to it too, which I think you're absolutely right. I think you've really hit the nail on the head with the halfway between Norwegian and
I think that's where we are. I think that's where we are. But
I think it's not a bad place to be.
No, in a way, no, it's a more comfortable place perhaps. But the Greeks do, I think, live for the moment, and that's quite attractive when you're out there living in the moment with them, and then you come back to Sevenoaks.
Exactly.
Wherever you are, I assume Sevenoaks.
Yeah, we're in Sevenoaks now, but living in the moment is something that we English long to do, but just can't quite indulge in.
That's why we go to Greece for our holidays. We live in the moment for a fortnight a year. That sounds a nice experience. Anyway, it's lovely to meet you. Thank you.
And you.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think if we could move on to Lara's iPhone, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question of Victoria?
Hello. Yes, sure. Sorry if the connection's bad. I've had like a few issues at the moment. I really love your books. I found Those Who Are Loved so powerful. I just wondered if you had any advice for someone who's trying to get into writing, like any advice in terms of how to motivate yourself, what you do to set yourself a routine in the day to get your writing done?
Gosh, well, my advice always is that don't wait until you really feel like doing it. Just set aside a time of day that you start and a number of hours that you're going to do it. And it is amazing how something will come. You know, you might have an hour of chewing your pencil and thinking, well, I'll just go off and have a coffee or, you know, do something else. But actually physically sitting there. I don't know if you've read a book by Stephen King called On Writing, and that's, I'm sure it's available in the Sevenoaks Bookshop, because it's just the Bible for writers, and you know, he kind of leads you through it in a way that, you know, I couldn't possibly in, you know, under 2 hours, but he really sets out how he writes, what motivates him, and he's quite sort of, He's quite brutal. I mean, I haven't read Stephen King's novels. This is just a book that I happened to be given, and I've given it to probably 25 people since. You know, he's quite brutal about it. He says, you know, don't just wait for inspiration. You know, it will come when you're sitting there. So Stephen King, I recommend. And yeah, don't only do it when you feel like doing it. The ideas will sometimes come when you're not expecting them. So I hope that's helpful.
It is. Thank you very much. I've heard a few
Okay.
people mention that book, so
Oh, have
I'll
you?
definitely
Oh,
go and
go.
pick
I mean,
that one up.
I think it's £7.99. You know, it's a real
Worth doing.
bargain. It's worth £700.99. So yeah, definitely order it.
Okay, thank
Do
you
you
very
have
much.
any, Fleur? Do you have any? Ah,
I think there's just been
great.
published some sort of anniversary edition. I don't know if it's 10 years, 20 years, or whenever since he first wrote it. But with the writers groups that we have in the bookshop, this year's starters were all given a copy.
Oh, great, great.
So
No,
it's a good start.
It's worth its weight in gold. I've never read anything better on writing. So good. I'm glad you keep it there.
Thank you, Victoria. I wanted to ask you a little bit. You've mentioned several times about how much you were reading during lockdown, and I wondered if you could share with us what you were reading.
Okay, well, I decided I had no more excuses vis-a-vis a certain book, which I'd always felt guilty about not reading, afraid of reading, anxious, inadequate, all those things that sometimes a book, you know, can make you feel. And that was War and Peace. And in fact, it was our son, who's 27, and he said, Mum, it would be really nice to be reading something together. It would be motivating. And in fact, we picked up Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment to start with. And then he came to me, you know, we were both sitting there with these very heavy books. And he said, actually, it's making me feel anxious. It's quite a dark book. So I was happy to move on. So the next was War and Peace. He said, let's try that. It's Tolstoy. And I have never read a better book in my life. I cannot, you know, I'm probably quite boring to my friends about it now, and I'm sure lots of people listening have read it too. But I read a translation, which is the most recent one into English, by someone called Anthony Briggs, who must be a genius. It's the Penguin classic. And it was so unexpected, Fleur. It was, a lot of it's very funny. You know, it's about the big themes. It focuses, you know, I'd always thought there'll be 5,000 characters with impossible names, but there aren't. You know, there's probably 8 or 9, the main characters, you know, and then there are some that you're more interested in others. So those are the ones that you know, Bezukhov is mine. I just love Pierre. He's just such a bumbling, wonderful, flawed, funny, sad, tragic character. You know, he's everything, and yet he's very believable. So I absolutely loved it. I think there were 1,400 pages, and I felt really bereft when I finished it. I felt really sad, you know, that it wasn't there anymore for me to dip into. But I thoroughly recommend that this winter to anyone who hasn't yet read it. I mean, I probably am the only person who hadn't ever read it, but it was joyful. So now I'm going to go back to Crime and Punishment, you know, and pick up where I left off with that. So that was my main read for a couple of months. You know, it does take a while, but it was absolutely worth it. It's a really staggeringly good book, you know, very impossible to imagine how Tolstoy kind of kept track of what had happened in chapter 1 when he was on chapter, you know, 101. But it's a great edition. And again, if you've got it, I hope it will sell out very soon.
We did have it. You know what? It's funny. With lots of people chose big books to read in lockdown. Lots of people read The Mirror and the Light. And
Yes.
March, that was another biggie
Oh,
that
was it? Yeah.
but no, we didn't have many takers for War and Peace, so I'll definitely
Yeah.
make sure to
Because actually,
recommendation.
yeah, and even the war bits, even the battle scenes were absolutely gripping, you know, and he's very philosophical. You know, you suddenly get these whole passages which are Tolstoy, you know, giving you his view on fate, you know, how the big events of history really happen. You know, it's not because suddenly out of, you know, under the stars is born this great man. It's much more chaotic than that. So I found the voice of Tolstoy really interesting. And, you know, he's very funny about Napoleon, really comical, absolutely brilliant. I can't recommend it highly enough. I really can't.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. And then I thought I'd just finish. It's a double reading question, because I think your books have been such a window on Greece and sort of, you know, recent Greek history. And I wondered, are there any Greek writers who are available in English that you would like to recommend?
Yeah, there aren't enough of them is the answer. You know, we don't translate enough Greek authors. So, but there's a really fantastic publisher called Europa, who are one of the few that do make sure to find. You know, in fact, they the first to publish Elena Ferrante, I think. So this was, you know, a fantastic success for them, because most of their writers are, you know, not so well known. But there's a fantastic author called Ioanna Caristiani, and she, you know, this is called Back to Delphi. You know, it couldn't be set anywhere else, and it's a mother-son relationship. And then there's another one of hers called Swell, which is also, you know, that she has a very particular voice. You know, you don't read it thinking, well, this could be an English book. You know, it's, you feel quite immersed in the modern Greek story here. So I love her very much. And she's also written, I think she's written some film scripts as well. So if somebody becomes a fan of hers, they can sort of follow her in other media. I tend a bit more to read poetry because I can read it in Greek and understand it, whereas a whole novel in Greek I find more difficult. And there are some wonderful editions of a poet called Cavafy, Cavafy, who is a 20th century poet and writes really extraordinary works that are very well translated, particularly by a translator called David Connolly. There's a lovely edition where you get the Greek on one side and the English on the other, which I love.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us about everything this evening. It's been such a delight.
It's a real pleasure, Fleur. It's lovely to know everybody's out there. I'm just going to go back to them because I've got everybody now.
Okay, perfect. And I just wanted to tell you all, because I know that you've all ordered this wonderful book, and there has been a slight delay from the publishers because we had hoped to be able to get them out in the post to you today, but they haven't arrived yet. But I've been promised that they are they were sort of leaving the warehouse this afternoon, so they're on their way. And as soon as we receive them, then we'll be in touch with everybody, whether you're picking them up from the bookshop or whether we're popping them in the post to you. So
gosh,
yeah. So,
I'm really sorry about that. That actually explains, because I was sent one copy, which I think was sort of slightly put together by hand. And I normally get about 5 sent to me at my house, and I haven't had mine yet. So I apologise. on their behalf.
It's not your responsibility. I have to say your publisher's been brilliant throughout lockdown, actually.
Oh, good.
Helping us keep all the people of Sevenoaks supplied in their books. So yeah, so but no, so they will be on their way. So I just wanted to mention that. And then just I thought actually if you all would like to unmute yourselves, because it's so hard to recreate a real life event, and then we can all sort of like say thank you and goodbye to Victoria, and you know you can say thank you, you can clap.
Lovely.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you.
It's really interesting.
Thank you very much to Fleur. Okay, bye. Happy reading in the autumn. That's the main thing.
Very much.
Thank you
Reading.
all so much for coming.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks, Fleur.
Victoria Polar.
Oh, thank you, Yasu. Wherever that comes from, Yasu. Kalinikta.
Kalinikta από την Thessaloniki.
Oh, very good.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Is it just us?
Oh, sorry, I've been on a lag the whole time. I think the internet has just gone all slow or something. It is, yeah. So I think I was just like a couple of seconds behind you. Oh, that was really good.
She's lovely, isn't she?
You're so nice.
Oh my god, like I've been thinking about your daughter. I mean, what authors are like that? Do you know what I mean?
Also, like, sorry, that is so different. Yeah, of course you record it. Like, why, like,